Sarah Mitchell was 28 when she decided she needed a break. After 6 years of service in the armed forces, 2 deployments to the Middle East, and countless sleepless nights, she had finally secured an extended leave of absence. It wasn't exactly retirement, but it was enough time to try and remember what it was like to live without the constant weight of responsibility on her shoulders. She chose a small bar on the outskirts of Nashville, Tennessee, far enough away from any military base that no one would recognize her. It was one of those places forgotten by modernity, with scratched wooden tables, a jukebox that still played 80s music, and a lingering smell of spilled beer that seemed to have seeped into the walls themselves. It was perfect, anonymous, quiet. Sarah was dressed in simple civilian clothes, faded jeans, and a plain black t-shirt. She had tied her blonde hair in a loose ponytail and left aside anything that might reveal her true identity. For one night, she wanted to be just another person drinking alone, trying to shut out the memories that insisted on returning whenever she closed her eyes. The bar was moderately crowded. There was a group of men in the corner, all appearing to be in their early 30s, dressed in flannel shirts and worn caps. They were the type who worked with their hands during the day and spent their hard-earned money at night on cheap beer and empty conversation. Sarah didn't pay much attention to them initially. She ordered a whiskey, sat on a stool near the bar, and let the amber liquid burn her throat in a way that was strangely comforting. It was after their second drink that they noticed her presence. One of them, a large man with a red beard and a face flushed from alcohol, approached, staggering slightly. He had that smug smile Sarah had seen thousands of times before, the kind that made him think charm and persistence were the same thing. "Hey girl, are you alone?" he asked, leaning awkwardly on the counter next to her. Sarah didn't even turn around. "I'm enjoying my own company, thank you." But he didn't get the message, or simply chose to ignore it. "Come on, no need to be so cold. My friends and I were thinking you could join us. We have a table over there in the corner. Some beers, some laughs. You seem like you could use a little fun." Sarah sighed. She really didn't want to deal with this, but she also knew that men like that rarely took no for an answer. "I really prefer to be alone tonight." The man with the red beard made an exaggerated expression of disappointment. "Oh, come on, don't be like a pretty girl like you shouldn't be drinking. It's sad." Before Sarah could answer, 2 of his friends approached as well. One was thin and tall, with small eyes and a smile that seemed too fake. The other was stocky, with broad shoulders and an aggressive attitude that emanated from him like the heat of hot asphalt. "Let me guess," said the skinny man, leaning dangerously close to her. "You just ended a relationship? Are you trying to forget someone? Because I can guarantee you that we're much better company than sitting here brooding alone." Sarah tightened her fingers around the whiskey glass, feeling the coldness of the glass against her skin. She was making a conscious effort to remain calm, to not let the irritation escalate into something more, but they kept pressing. "You know," said the stocky, crossing his arms in a way that was clearly intended to look intimidating, "you don't seem like the type to usually refuse company. What is it? Do you think you're too good for us?" Now, there was an aggressive edge to their voices. What had started as an awkward approach was rapidly turning into something more unpleasant. Sarah could feel the stares of other bar patrons, but no one seemed inclined to intervene. It was always like this. People preferred to pretend they didn't see anything. She finally turned completely to face them, and there was something in her eyes that should have served as a warning. It was a coldness that came from years of training, from situations where hesitating for a second could mean the difference between life and death. But the men were either too drunk or too arrogant to notice. "I'm going to say this one last time," Sarah said in a low but firm voice. "I'm not interested. Now go back to your table and leave me alone." The man with the red beard laughed, but it was a humorless laugh. "Oh, now you're being rude. We were just being polite, and you're acting like some kind of princess." That's when the skinny guy made a mistake. He reached out and touched Sarah's shoulder, leaving her there in a way that was both invasive and possessive. "Come on, darling. Stop being dramatic." Sarah's reaction was instantaneous. She grabbed his wrist, twisting it in a way that made him let out a muffled cry of pain as he was forced to bend his knee. It was a precise, controlled movement, executed with an efficiency that left no doubt she knew exactly what she was doing. "Don't touch me," she said in a voice that could cut. The other two men were momentarily paralyzed, shocked by the speed and effectiveness of her response. But surprise quickly gave way to anger. The stocky man advanced, his fists clenched, and Sarah released the skinny man's wrist only to prepare for the next confrontation. It was at that moment that someone shouted from the other side of the bar, "Hey, what's going on here?" The manager, an older man with gray hair and a stern expression, was walking briskly toward them. But the three men were beyond the point of listening to reason. The one with the red beard tried to grab Sarah by the arm, and she easily dodged, causing him to stumble and bump against a table. Pandemonium was brewing. Other customers were getting up, some trying to intervene, others simply watching with expressions of shock or morbid excitement. Sarah maintained position, her hands raised in a defensive stance but clearly ready to respond to any aggression. That's when his jacket, which had been hanging on the back of the chair, slipped and fell to the floor. And that's when everything changed. Tucked inside the jacket were a series of badges and insignia that Sarah had forgotten to remove. Among them was a particular insignia, one that was not commonly seen. It was a medal that was only awarded in extraordinary circumstances, the kind of recognition that came with stories that could never be fully told in public. One of the older men in the bar, who had been sitting quietly in a corner throughout the commotion, stood up abruptly. He had the bearing of someone who had also served, and his eyes widened when he recognized insignia. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice cutting through the noise like a whip, "I suggest you retreat, now." The man with the red beard, still a little dazed from having bumped his head on the table, looked at him, confused. "What? Who the hell are you?" The veteran pointed to the jacket on the ground. "Do you see that insignia over there? Do you know what it means?" The three men looked, but it was obvious they had no idea. The veteran continued, his voice now laden with an almost reverential respect. "That's a silver star, and that one over there is a Purple Heart medal. This woman here isn't just any soldier. She's a decorated hero. And you idiots were trying to intimidate her." A heavy silence fell over the bar. Faces that had been red with anger or excitement now paled. The stocky man took a step back, his hands falling to his side. Another man in the bar, this one noticeably younger but also with a visible military tattoo on his arm, stood up and positioned himself next to the veteran. He said, addressing Sarah with a sudden, respectful formality, "I served as well, and I just want to say that it's an honor to be in the same place as you." Sarah felt a wave of conflicting emotions. On the one hand, she hadn't wanted her identity revealed. On the other, there was something deeply satisfying in seeing those arrogant men finally understand who they were messing with. The older veteran approached, carefully picked up the jacket from the floor, and handed it to Sarah. "With all due respect, ma'am, you shouldn't have to hide who you are. These badges are earned, and each one has a story." Sarah picked up the jacket, her fingers unconsciously tracing the outlines of the medals. She hadn't spoken about what had happened to earn her those decorations, not even to her family. They were memories she preferred to keep locked away, buried deep where they couldn't hurt her. But now, in this forgotten bar in the middle of nowhere, those stories were being acknowledged without her having to say a single word. The three men who had assaulted her were now completely silent. The one with the red beard seemed especially pale, as if he finally understood the gravity of what they had done. The thin one was rubbing the wrist Sarah had twisted, looking at the floor with evident shame. We didn't know," the stocky man murmured, but the words sounded hollow even to his own ears. The veteran turned to them with an expression of pure disdain. "No, you didn't know. And do you know why? Because you were so busy being arrogant idiots that you didn't stop to think that maybe, just maybe, this woman deserved to be treated with respect from the start, regardless of who she is or what she's done." There were murmurs of agreement from other patrons in the bar. The atmosphere had completely changed. Where before there had been indifference or morbid curiosity, now there was a palpable solidarity directed towards Sarah. The bar manager, who had been paralyzed throughout the incident, finally found his voice. "You three, get out, now, and don't come back." The men didn't argue. They gathered their things and left quickly. their heads down, avoiding all the stares that followed them to the door. When the door finally closed behind them, Sarah let out a long, tired sigh. She hadn't wanted this. She hadn't wanted the attention. She hadn't wanted to be put on a pedestal. All she wanted was a quiet night to try and forget, even if only temporarily, the weight she carried. The older veteran was still by her side. "I'm sorry for exposing you like that," he said softly, "but those guys needed to learn a lesson. And frankly, you deserve for people to know what you've done for this country." Sarah shook her head slightly. "I didn't do anything that thousands of others haven't done, and many of them didn't come home to receive medals." There was a grim truth in those words, and the veteran nodded understandingly. "I know. I saw friends who deserved those medals far more than I did, but they weren't around to receive them. That's why we, who return, have to carry those stories for them as well." Sarah felt a lump in her throat. It was rare to find someone who truly understood, someone who had been there and seen the same things she had seen. The bar manager approached, bringing a bottle of whiskey. "Miss, this one's on the house. And anything else you want tonight. It's the least I can do." Sarah accepted with a nod. She poured a generous shot into her glass and raised it slightly toward the veteran and the others who had remained by her side. "For those who didn't return," she said simply. "For those who did not return," they echoed, their voices laden with a weight that only those who had served could truly understand. The rest of the evening passed in a sort of peaceful truce. People came up to Sarah occasionally, not to harass intrusive questions, but simply to shake her hand or offer a respectful nod. It was strange and uncomfortable in its own way, but there was also something human about it, a connection she hadn't felt in a long time. When she finally decided to, the veteran accompanied her to the door. "Do you have a place to stay?" he asked, not in an intrusive way, but with genuine concern. "I have a hotel a few kilometers from here," Sarah replied. "I'll be fine." He nodded. "Take care, soldier. And if you ever need to talk to someone who understands, you can always find people like us. We look out for each other." Sarah smiled for the first time that night, a small but genuine smile. "Thank you, really." She stepped out into the cool night, the air carrying the scent of impending rain. As she walked to her car, Sarah gazed at the starry sky and allowed herself a moment of reflection. Perhaps she could never completely escape who she was or what she had done. But perhaps, just perhaps, she didn't need to. Perhaps it was possible to find peace not through forgetting, but through acceptance and the recognition that her journey, however difficult it had been, had meant something. She got into the car, started the engine, and drove back to the hotel, carrying with her not only the medals in her jacket, but also a newfound understanding that even in the most unlikely places, there were still people willing to recognize and honor sacrifice. Sarah drove along the empty roads of Tennessee, the lights on the car's dashboard softly illuminating her face as country music played softly on the radio. She hadn't intentionally turned it on, but she hadn't bothered to turn it off either. There was something fitting about those songs of loss, redemption, and lonely journey that resonated with her current state of mind. The hotel was a modest roadside establishment, the kind of place that rented rooms for $50 a night and didn't ask questions. Sarah had specifically chosen this type of accommodation because she wanted to remain invisible, just another traveler passing through. But after the events of that night, she wondered if it was really possible for someone like her to simply disappear into the crowd. When he entered the room, he threw his jacket onto the bed and stared at it for a long moment. The insignias glowed faintly under the fluorescent light from the ceiling. Each one had a story, a specific moment in time that had changed the course of his life forever. The Silver Star had come from an operation in Afghanistan, a mission that had gone terribly wrong. She was a lieutenant at the time, leading a platoon through a narrow valley when they were ambushed. The attack had been coordinated and brutal, designed to trap and eliminate her unit. Completely? Sarah could still hear the sounds of that afternoon if she wanted to, the rumble of gunfire echoing against the Rocky Mountain, the cries of her men for cover or medical assistance. She had made a decision in that moment that many soldiers face but few want to admit they make. Instead of retreating and potentially saving herself, Sarah had advanced directly into the line of fire, drawing the enemy's attention away from her wounded soldiers. It had been a desperate maneuver, the kind of thing that only works in movies or on the rare occasions when luck and training align perfectly. She had managed to flank the enemy position, using the rugged terrain to her advantage, and neutralize 3 snipers before the rest of her unit could regroup and counterattack. When it was all over, 6 of her men were wounded, but all were alive. She herself had escaped with only a few scratches and a graze wound on her shoulder that she had barely noticed until the adrenaline began to wear off. Her commander had insisted on the medal, saying that her courage and leadership under direct fire had saved lives. Sarah had accepted the medal, but had never felt comfortable with it. For her, it hadn't been courage. It had simply been doing what needed to be done, what any leader should do for their troops. The Purple Heart Medal was a different story, more personal, and in some ways, more painful to remember. It had happened during her second deployment, this time in Iraq. Sarah had been promoted to captain and was overseeing security operations in a particularly volatile region near Baghdad. They had received intelligence about a possible insurgent hideout in an abandoned residential complex. The mission was supposedly simple, a standard search and seizure operation. But when their team entered the building, everything fell apart in a matter of seconds. The place was booby-trapped with improvised explosives, cruel devices designed to kill or maim anyone who entered. The first one detonated when one of her sergeants stepped on a trigger hidden under the rubble. The explosion was devastating, tearing through the narrow corridor and throwing Sarah against a concrete wall with enough force to break 3 of her ribs and puncture her lung. She remembered falling to the ground, struggling to breathe, the world spinning in a blur of pain and she could hear voices screaming, hands pulling her, trying to get her out of the building before more explosives were detonated. The last thing she saw before losing consciousness was the face of her sergeant, the same man who had stepped on the first explosive, covered in blood, but still alive, still fighting. Sarah spent 3 weeks in a military hospital, first in Baghdad, and then transferred to Germany. Her ribs healed over time, as did her lung, although she still felt an occasional twinge when breathing deeply on cold days. But the unseen scars were the ones that hurt the most. 2 of her soldiers hadn't survived that operation. One had died instantly in the initial explosion. The other had held on for almost an hour while doctors desperately tried to stabilize him, but the damage had been too extensive. Sarah had been unconscious throughout it all, unable to be there for her men when they needed her most. This feeling of helplessness haunted her more than any nightmare about the explosions or the fighting. She was their commander, responsible for their lives, and she had failed. The Purple Heart Medal had arrived along with a promotion and praise from senior officers for her bravery and sacrifice. Sarah had accepted it all with an expressionless face, uttering the right words and making the appropriate gestures. But inside, she felt only emptiness and guilt. Now, sitting in this anonymous hotel room, Sarah picked up her jacket and held the medals in her hand. They were heavy, not only physically, but with the weight of the memories and expectations they carried. For years, she had avoided wearing them, keeping them stored in a drawer or at the back of a closet where she didn't need to look at them. But that night at the bar had changed something. Seeing the recognition in the eyes of those veterans, feeling the solidarity and respect emanating from them, had awakened something in her that had been dormant for a long time. Perhaps it wasn't shame she should feel, but rather a responsibility to honor those who couldn't be there to tell their own stories. Sarah stood up and walked to the small, dusty mirror on. She looked at her reflection, at the woman looking back. She looked older than her 28 years, lines of worry etched into her face, a hardness in her eyes that hadn't been there when she first enlisted. She had joined the army at 19, full of idealism and a desire to serve her country. She had grown up in a small town in Montana, the daughter of a farmer and a teacher, and had always admired those who wore the uniform. For her, it was more than just a job or a career. It was a calling, a chance to be part of something bigger than herself. The first few years had been everything she had hoped for. The training had been brutal, but rewarding, molding her into someone stronger and more capable than she ever imagined possible. She had excelled in every aspect, from physical conditioning to tactical strategy, earning the respect of her instructors and colleague. Her first deployment had been in East Africa, a peacekeeping mission that rarely saw actual combat. Sarah had spent most of that time helping to coordinate humanitarian aid deliveries and train local security forces. It had been important, meaningful work, but part of her longed for something more. She had achieved her wish in the second deployment, although she quickly discovered that the reality of war was very different from the romanticized images she had in her head. There was nothing glorious in seeing friends wounded or killed, nothing noble in making life or death decisions in fractions of a second, knowing that any choice could have devastating consequences. But she had adapted, as all soldiers do. She learned to compartmentalize, to put her emotions in separate boxes that she could only open when it was safe to do so. She developed coping mechanisms, routines that kept her focused and functional, even when everything inside her wanted to scream or fall apart. And it had worked. For a time, Sarah had completed her missions with distinction, earning praise and promotions, but the cost had been high. Relationships at home had suffered or disappeared completely. Her family didn't understand why she kept volunteering for deployments when she could have accepted safer positions on home bases. Childhood friends had moved on with their lives, getting married, having children, building civilian careers that seemed infinitely distant from Sarah's reality. She'd had a few romantic relationships over the years, but none had lasted. How could she explain to someone who had never served what it was like to wake up in the middle of the night in a panic, convinced she was still under attack? How could she share the guilt she felt every time she saw the families of the soldiers she'd lost, knowing they blamed her, even if they never said it aloud? Sarah stepped away from the mirror and sat on the edge of the bed. She picked up her phone and scrolled through her contacts, stopping at a name she hadn't called in months. It was Jackson, one of her sergeants from the first deployment, someone who had become a close friend during those difficult years. She hesitated, her thumb hovering over the call button. It was almost midnight, too late to call without a good reason. But then she thought about what the veteran at the bar had said, about how they looked after each other, and decided to take the chance. The phone rang 3 times before Jackson answered, his voice hoarse with sleep, but immediately alert. It was a habit all soldiers developed, the ability to go from deep sleep to fully awake in seconds. "Sarah, are you okay? What happened?" There was genuine concern in his voice, and she felt a wave of guilt for having woken him. "Hey, Jackson. Sorry about the time, I just needed to hear a friendly voice." There was a pause, and then she heard movement on the other end, probably him sitting up in bed or leaving the room so as not to wake his wife. "No need to apologize. You know you can call anytime. What's going on? Where are you?" Sarah gave a short, humorless laugh. "I'm in a seedy hotel in Tennessee, drinking cheap whiskey and having an existential crisis. Just a typical Tuesday night." Jackson didn't laugh. He knew her well enough to know when she was using humor to mask something deeper. "Talk to me, Sarah. What's really going on?" And then, for the first time in months, Sarah began to speak. She recounted the incident at the bar, how she had tried to remain anonymous, but had been exposed by the very medals she wore. She spoke of the guilt she still felt for the soldiers she had lost, of how each decoration seemed more like an accusation than an honor. Jackson listened patiently, interrupting only occasionally to ask a question or offer a reassuring comment. When she finally finished, tears were streaming down Sarah's face, something she rarely allowed to happen. "Sarah," Jackson said gently, "you know none of those men would have blamed you, right? They knew that risks when they enlisted just like we did, and you did everything you could to bring them home safely. But it wasn't enough," Sarah murmured, her voice breaking. "I should have seen the signs. I should have been more careful, more vigilant." "You were human," Jackson replied firmly. "And even being human, you saved more lives than most people will ever have the chance to save. These medals aren't just about individual moments of heroism. They're about a lifelong commitment to putting others before yourself. And no one who knows you would doubt that commitment." Sarah wiped her eyes, feeling some of the tension she had carried for so long begin to ease. "How do you cope with this? With the memories? With the guilt?" There was a long sigh on the other end. "Honestly, some days are easier than others. I go to therapy, I talk to my wife, I try to focus on the present instead of getting stuck in the past. but I also accept that these experiences are part of who I am now. They changed me, and I can't undo that. So I try to use what I've learned to be a better person, to help other veterans who are going through the same thing." They talked for another hour, exchanging stories and memories, some painful and others surprisingly funny. When they finally said goodbye, Sarah felt lighter than she had felt in months. She lay on the bed, still dressed, and stared at the stained ceiling. For the first time, she allowed herself to truly consider what came next. Her leave was scheduled to last another 3 months. She could return to active duty after that, or she could explore other options. There were veterans programs, opportunities in civilian life, paths she had never seriously considered because the military had been her identity for so long. But perhaps it was time to start thinking of Sarah Mitchell not just as a captain or a soldier, but as a complete person with interests and dreams beyond the battlefield. Perhaps those medals could be a reminder not only of what she had lost, but of what she had gained, of the strength and resilience she had developed. Sarah finally closed her eyes, and for the first time in a long time, slept without nightmare, lulled by the feeling that perhaps, perhaps, she could find peace not despite who she was, but because of it.